a hard name. I'm Hofmacher.
Cool. Can I go ahead and unplug?
Yeah, you should plug in.
Keep talking, because this
I'll keep talking.
takes a minute.
So, you guys probably know who these guys are, right? They've been around for a long time. They've done a lot of great work that we are all profiting from. So, awesome for that. Thank you. But today they're going to talk about the new endeavor that they're on, which is BackDrop. And BackDrop, in its simplest form, is a fork of Drupal, but we'll get more details from them.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for being here.
So you can hold that if you want.
Yeah, I've got this one. You've got that one.
That one's the real sensitive mic.
Okay. And this is the webcast one, too.
See, that one's going there.
Okay.
It's really strong.
Hello, Internet. Hello, Iowa.
IRL.
IRL, yeah. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. We're here to talk about BackDrop, as we like to say, because there's a cost that comes with change. I'm Nate Haug, and this is Jen Lampton. And let's go ahead and get started with some scary charts. Scary charts.
So over the past few years, there's been a couple of changes in the atmosphere around Drupal. In particular, we've got a couple of graphs that show just kind of what people on the web are talking about lately. This is a CMS trend graph, so if you go to Google and you try and figure out like who's talking about Drupal, you'll notice that people talked about it a lot back in 2008, and is that 2009? 2009, and since then it's been kind of declining. So since then people have been talking about other things more than Drupal. And we're just going to kind of try and figure out what's going on and why and what we can do about it. This is another chart from Drupal.org. This is all of the sites that are currently running Drupal, which versions they're running. And if you look at the blue line there, the one that's decreasing really slowly, that is Drupal 6. Is that right?
Yep.
And so it looks like most of the people who are running Drupal 6 sites have not yet upgraded them yet. So 2009 was about when Drupal 6 was most popular. So trying to figure out what it was about Drupal 6 that people either loved or haven't been able to get away from.
Yeah, we also have a line here saying that creation of new sites is not increasing, and we're just not saying it's not increasing at the rate that it should be. In a software platform that is growing, that is expanding its developer base at a consistent rate, the developers should be producing more sites as more developers are created. So therefore, it should be kind of more like an exponential curve rather than a constant curve. A constant curve basically means we have the same size developer base kind of producing websites at a regular rate. You know, like we still produce websites, you know, and there's regular churn on that. So it is increasing. There's no need for panic. It's just not increasing fast enough, really.
And this next graph is the number of commits that are happening on Drupal.org. And it's important to note this is not core. This is all of Drupal.org. So contrib modules, contrib themes, distributions. And if you look at what's been happening, there's a couple of spikes here that are actually, I think, spam. But generally speaking, that number of commits is going down. So that means our contrib community is not as active as they were back in 2011. So we need to figure out why. And the number of people that are creating accounts on Drupal.org, this is also not increasing. And we want to know, like, why aren't we drawing new people at an increasing rate to Drupal? So what are we going to do about this problem? There's a couple of different options. Drupal 8 is obviously aware of everything that's going on in the ecosystem, and they're making some big changes to change how Drupal does things to try and make it more appealing to new developers and try and turn some of these trends around. We have a alternate solution to how we can kind of deal with some of these things where we're also trying to change things and turn things around, but in a very different way than Drupal 8, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. And then we're also seeing a bunch of people from the existing community start to look at different alternatives. Rather than looking into the future of Drupal, they're looking at, well, you know, what else is on the market? Like the web is a changing landscape. Maybe we'll go, you know, try WordPress. Maybe we don't need such a complicated site. Or maybe we'll go look at Squarespace and have some fancy tools to manage things, or other open source PHP CMSs that are in the market now that weren't back in the day. But we're here to talk to you about BackDrop CMS. So before we get too far into what BackDrop is, you're probably thinking like, what? Like, who are you guys to tell us Drupal 8 is doing it wrong or you want to do it differently? So we want to kind of give you a little bit of our background. Both of us have been professional Drupal trainers for a number of years. Together we've taught more than 1,500 students, teaching them how to learn how to use Drupal, how to code for Drupal, basically Drupal-only training. We've created training materials for training classes, and some of them that you guys are probably attending now, we've written. We're both featured in Drupalize Me training videos. Nate's been a trainer at Lullabot since 2005. I was the director of training at Chapter 3 in San Francisco for a couple of years. And Nate's the co-author of O'Reilly book using Drupal. So we have experienced what it's like to learn Drupal for new people, maybe.
Repeatedly, actually, because every time you teach someone else, it feels like you're getting the experience of learning it for the first time all over again, every time. So we feel like we've been over this experience of like getting people through and teaching them Drupal for the first time, and having had to learn Drupal 8 and work on adopting it yourself, we're kind of terrified of trying to teach it to new people, is the feeling that we have. We're also really active in the core community. I've been doing stuff since Drupal 5 days, and in Drupal 6, I was well known for putting in the original Ajax framework. Back then it was called the AHA framework, but the Ajax framework that we originally got in Drupal 6, I wrote the file and image modules in Drupal 7 and got those into core, and did a whole bunch of stuff like field UI that we almost didn't get in Drupal 7. I'm sorry, that was my fault for shoving that in there. And even in Drupal 8, I was still really involved in Drupal 8 land. I did a whole bunch of work on the dialogue system, creating the original, or like the JavaScript for how the dialogue system works, as well as being the sort of sole driving force for CK editor module over Aloha. So it definitely have been active even recently. And Jen, on the other hand,
I'm a little newer to core development. My first core patch wasn't included until 7.14. Took me a while to realize that there's a lot of stuff wrong with Drupal and anyone can fix it. But before that, I was a member of the Drupal core usability team, so I did a lot of studies on how people interact with the interfaces and how we can make Drupal easier to use. I did that through the Drupal 7 cycle and into Drupal 8. And then in Drupal 8 world, I was a Twig initiative lead for a couple of years, trying to help change the theme layer from what I thought was too hard to teach people to something that I think is going to be much easier for people to learn. And we also have been getting a lot of flack for BackDrop CMS being a fork of the community. And I wanted to explain just from a personal perspective that I am much more about community than I am about the code. I've been a lead organizer for BadCamp for the last few years. I started doing that back in 2007, long before I ever contributed any code, even as a module, a contrib module on Drupal.org. I was on the organizing committee for DrupalCon San Francisco in 2010. I've been a member of the Berkeley Drupal user meetup since it started in 2006, San Francisco meetup since it started in 2009, and the East Bay Drupal user meetup since 2013. And I feel like I am more interested in the people that are using Drupal and the people that are working on Drupal than I am in the code. And so part of what we're doing here with BackDrop is about preserving that community of people.
So this is an overview of our entire roadmap. It may look kind of familiar to you guys for anyone that has been involved in the Drupal 8 cycle, because basically we're saying we like what Drupal 8 is trying to accomplish in terms of feature set, and we think that they're headed in the right direction in almost all of these situations where it's like, yes, we want an easier way to be able to move things between dev stage and live, which is what configuration management is about. Views module is already installed on over 80% of all Drupal websites. That should be a part of core. Blocks and layouts are one of the most important and critical systems in Drupal, but is probably one of the most rudimentary, ancient, crufty systems that we have in place. WYSIWYG support, it's time for that. Obviously, I was really involved in that, and we need to have it here in BackDrop. Improving the editorial experience, as that's where most action actually happens on a Drupal website. That's your end user experience that, as far as editors are concerned, that's where they are. Improved mobile support. Drupal 7 came out, what's the date? We're going on 4 years, 5 years ago. The web has changed a lot in the last 5 years, and we're hobbling along with Drupal 7 before all of mobile. I think it was Drupal 7 came out like 2 or 3 months after the iPhone was released, and that kind of tells you it's like we were totally not ready for mobile in the Drupal 7 cycle, and we've been trying to work with a system that really just wasn't capable of dealing with the modern web, which is where HTML5 is as well. We don't have any support for HTML5 fields in Drupal 7. And improving the performance. This is something that is actually probably different from Drupal 8, because Drupal 8 is striving for improving performance, but right now it is not faster.
It's not done yet.
Yeah, it's not done yet, but it's almost certainly not faster. The complexity of Drupal 8 has made it more pluggable and more swappable, more extensible, and more scalable perhaps than ever before, but it has also made it slower. So if you're working with fewer resources, then it becomes clear that you're going to need like more powerful servers. Basically, it's tough. Like shared hosting has clearly been relegated to a thing of the past for Drupal 8 at least. And so one of the things, probably one of the biggest differentiators, is that we're sticking with the existing system. So that means we're not increasing a lot of the complexity, which means that our performance is really quite comparable to Drupal 7, and we think that we will be faster than Drupal 7, which is great. Reducing the theme system complexity in Drupal 8 land, this was done through Twig, because BackDrop has a slightly different approach to backwards compatibility. We value it very strongly, as opposed to Drupal, which says no backwards compatibility. That is our policy. That we're working on reducing the theme system complexity, but doing it with the existing PHP template system instead of rewriting it in Twig. And finally, improved multilingual support. We're adopting a lot of Drupal 8's multilingual support in doing things like making English not a required language, and improving a number of systems that can be translated. So this is our overall system, like what we're hoping to produce for our initial release of BackDrop. I kind of got into this a little bit. I couldn't help myself during the roadmap, but what's the deal? Like, okay, so BackDrop is almost like Drupal 8, right? Like, why do this? Why do something so drastic as a fork of Drupal, something that we've been a part of for the last 7 years?
So we've got a list of what I refer to as the 5 Ds. These are the things that we don't really like about Drupal. The first one is how different it is from the latest version of Drupal. So Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 are vastly different from each other, and that's the first thing. The next one is the decision-making process. Nate and I both spent the majority of our recent history working on core, and we know how decisions are made or how decisions aren't made in the Drupal world, and so we want to kind of approach that from a new perspective, trying to make that a little better. We also don't have the same developer audience in mind with BackDrop as we do with Drupal 8. And the direction of the project, obviously we're going to be starting from the same place but pointing somewhere different long term. We can talk about that. And then we've also been hearing a lot of distress from the existing Drupal community, and we want to kind of think about what it is they're saying and try and address some of those issues. So the first one is difference. And if you install Drupal 8 and start working with it, you'll notice, like, out of the box, it looks the same. Like, the experience of using the tool feels very similar to you. So we're not talking about difference in terms of what it looks like or what it feels like to use. What we're talking about is the difference in the code. If you open up a Drupal 7 version of a module, I think this one is, I can't even tell which module that is, contact or something. Anyway, if you look at a module in Drupal 7, there's like a distinct number of files, maybe 10 files that control what's involved in this module. And if you look at it in Drupal 8, like, this is a screenshot from my editor, and you can't even see all of the files from a single module open in that entire window. Like, there's just everything has been broken up into a little tiny piece, and it's been put into its own location. And this is the kind of thing where if you're not familiar with modern development and you're just like, oh, I want to open this file and contribute, it's It's overwhelming, and coming from an experience where you've known Drupal 7, you look at Drupal 8, trying to figure out how it all got moved from place to place is going to be really hard for people. It's the difference in code. Does anybody know what this number represents?
Roughly.
So this is actually from like a month or so ago, but this is the number of contributed modules that are made for Drupal 7. So if you think about what makes Drupal great, it's not core alone. It is all of the wonderful pieces that you can plug in and build the Lego house of your dreams with. And that is the contributed modules. And so if you think about how we're going to get from this set of contributed modules we have from Drupal 7 into the modules for Drupal 8, you've got to look at the code, right? So you've got to say, okay, well, we've got all these developers that have to make that transition from this set of 10 reasonable files to a lot more. And not that they're unreasonable, it's just really different.
Yeah, and this applies both to contributed modules. Like the difference has a severe impact on contributed modules. There's been some efforts recently, like the D8 Rules Initiative, in which they've said like we need $100,000 in order to port rules to Drupal 8, and without this funding, we expect that it will take us 1.5 years to port the module to Drupal 8. And 1.5 years to port, I mean, granted, rules is not a simple module. It's one of
but it's just
more popular, but it's just one
of these more than 8,000 modules.
Right, and we're in a situation. Well, I'm in a situation as a contributed module author with a module like Webform, which is, besides views, the most popular site building module, non-utility module on Drupal.org. And we're looking at this and we're just like, this is going to take a long time, like 1 year or more, to port this module to Drupal 8, especially in fully functional. But this is in contributed land where we are working together as a community. But for individual websites, of all of the code that any individual web developer has built or a product that they have created that is heavily built on the existing Drupal 7, they're looking at enormous reinvestment to port all of their existing code to Drupal 8. The Drupal 8 mentality around upgrading is rather than update and upgrade, it's basically rebuild and replace. Rebuild and migrate. So instead of taking your existing code and porting it forward, the mentality is basically just start with a new Drupal 8 website, rebuild the entire thing, and then migrate your data from the old one. Because the difference is so great, it's almost easier to just start from scratch than it is to upgrade your existing code. So difference is a big problem.
And the next one is how decisions are made in Drupal.
So basically, the way things work in Drupal land is it is almost entirely driven by this Drupal-like concept called duocracy. And as far as we know, Drupal invented this terminology of duocracy is this idea that if you want to do something, oh, sorry, Zendoodle, see how you're laughing because you're quoted in this slide. Yes, thank you for the quote. Yeah, we pulled these off of Twitter, I do believe, or I guess in this case, a blog post. But this is the way Drupal works, is that if you feel that something should happen, you can make it happen. And that's an enormously powerful thing for Drupal, and that's the way a lot of people really feel this sense of ownership for the project. That if you feel like you want something to be done, all that you have to do is invest the time and energy to do it, and it will happen.
We've got a couple of really good examples of that. Nate and I are both benefactors of this system of if you believe something should happen, you can get it done. Twig is a great example of that. It was not on anyone's roadmap to convert to Twig, but the entire community said, there's something wrong with the theme system, we need to fix it, and we decided on a solution, we made it happen in Drupal 8. And so I've benefited a lot from that. Nate did also the same thing with the WYSIWYG editor. That wasn't part of an initiative, it was just something where it's like, hey, it's time, we need to get this done, and we were able to get things done. So we've both benefited a lot from this system. There's a lot of good things about having a duocracy, but there's also some downsides.
So this is an example of something that kind of went awry, we believe. And this was from the Drupal 7 cycle, that we spent a whole lot of effort building out a database abstraction layer in Drupal 7 known as dbtng. And we also did a whole bunch of work rewriting CCK into what now became the field module. And two of the biggest hurdles in this was making it so that we could swap out any database system we wanted to instead of using MySQL or Postgres and that we could do things like put stuff into alternative field storage other than the database, like we could put it into Mongo, for example, actually Mongo exclusively. As it turns out, the demand for this really wasn't there, you know? Like there was, like a lot of this effort was basically thought up by, like we really want this abstraction to be here because our employers are paying us to do this.
Or because somebody might want it
or because
later.
somebody might want it later. And it's a really good example of like a drastic increase in the complexity of our code. And actually, in the case of like our alternative field storage, and actually both of these, they had really serious performance regressions that came from this abstraction. And it was a situation where something that seemed like it was a good idea was actually just, it was entirely unnecessary in terms of like,
yeah, if you look at the numbers of people who are actually using these systems today, you can see that there's very low demand for both of them. That doesn't mean there isn't anyone using it. There are a few people using both. But this is the kind of thing that you have to ask yourself, like, does this belong in core? Like, if it only represents this 0.0001% of people using it, why is that in core? And why does the other 99% of people have to pay the cost in terms of performance and complexity in order to deal with these systems?
So this is the downside of bureaucracy, that when money comes into play, if a particular company or an individual that has a lot of time and energy wants something done, they can make it happen even if it's not necessarily beneficial to the wider community.
So the next thing that we're concerned about is the intended developer audience for this software. And we've got a quote here from an interview that Dries had in early 2013 about how he thinks there's two different kinds of developers, and we kind of agree with this too. That there are people who learn to code by working in Drupal, and then there are people who are professional developers. And these are not separate audiences. Like, a lot of people learn to code through Drupal and become professional developers. My experience is that, I did a lot of coding in school, but in the real world, when I actually got my chops into it, I started in Drupal, and that's kind of how I learned how things work. So my perspective is very much through the I do this through Drupal, and then I've become a professional Drupal developer. So that's me as well. And there are a lot of people, I think, in our community who can speak to that same experience.
Yeah, when we first released, when we first announced BackDrop, we presented this chart, and this is largely hypothetical in terms of the post-Drupal 8 world. Drupal 7 and Drupal 6, this is based on basically the usage statistics. So it's not exactly a direct correlation. There's no way that we could actually pull up these numbers and back it up with data. So this is merely our interpretation of the current situation. This is
a breakdown of the developer audience here, where the dark blue represents
professional developers.
And the light blue are the people who learn to code through Drupal.
Yeah, and what we think will happen with the Drupal 8 cycle is we think that the number of professional developers will find Drupal 8 really appealing and will continue to increase. But overall, because the amateur or self-taught market might be shying away from Drupal more than ever before, we think that market could potentially atrophy.
And based on our experience from Drupal, trying to train people and trying to talk to people at conferences, we feel like the community is made up right now of probably half and half. Right? There's maybe half people who come to Drupal without significant coding experience and half people who do. And that might even be generous. I think there's actually more people who aren't professional developers in Drupal. And so we're wondering, what is that landscape going to feel like in a world where the code is tuned not toward the larger segment of our community, but towards the smaller one?
So what we're hoping to do is, we're hoping the BackDrop will basically fill a down market gap. We really feel that Drupal is moving more towards the high end, and that professional developers will find Drupal 8 more appealing than any version of Drupal before, which is great, and it's moving into new markets on the high end. But we feel that the low end of the market is getting cut out by these improvements. And so what we're trying to do is take the existing Drupal 7 code, which Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 are drastically different, and we're taking the Drupal 7 code and continuing it along its current trajectory without rewriting it. And we're hoping that we can make it so that we can take the complexities, like some of the things like the alternative field storage, for example, and start removing these layers of complexity and start making it so that these things are more directly implemented for a more specific segment of the market. So basically, we're trying to make a down-market product rather than the up-market product that Drupal 8 itself is filling.
And we're hoping that BackDrop and Drupal will be like brothers, and together we'll be able to fill the entire market. And so you have professional developers in both, but probably mostly in Drupal 8, and you'll have amateur developers in both, but maybe mostly in BackDrop. And so hopefully together we can kind of fill the entire need of the market. Rule the internet. All right. So the last complaint we have about Drupal 8 is the current direction of the project. And this is something that we did a bunch of research on too when we first started thinking about forking. We tried to figure out like what is the direction of Drupal, because it's not something that's necessarily published. So we did a bunch of look at what's happening to the code. Do you want to take this?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, so in terms of things that are happening in the Drupal 8 land, the code base is a lot larger than it ever has been before. And a lot of that is because there are a lot more external libraries. And some of the justification for that is that, well, it's great that we don't have to maintain this code anymore because we're depending on an external library instead. But in a lot of cases, what that's done is it's taken something, well, one of my favorite examples is what happened in Aggregator module, where we took 400 lines of custom code that previously generated aggregated, so it would suck in RSS feeds and then turn them into aggregator items. And we took out those 400 lines of custom code and we replaced it with 100 lines of integration code with an external library. Yay, great, less code, right? Except that the external library was Zenfeeds, which is a 10,000 line library. And it's like, well, are we actually saving a whole lot of work here by depending on a ginormous external library with a small amount of integration code instead of just a small amount of custom code in the first place? Like the not invented here policy, or sorry, what the proudly found elsewhere initiative has almost like swung too far, like in terms of like, let's just throw in every external library that we run across if we can remove even the smallest amount of custom code. And that's resulted in a much larger code base overall, with the justification that you don't have to learn the small Drupal custom bit. If you're already familiar with that external library, you can benefit from knowing that external library, but only if you already know that external library. So it ends up with more code overall that you need to become familiar with, because it's Drupal's code and then all of the external libraries. This is probably one of the bigger things, is that Symfony, when it initially went in, it was supposed to be this underlying layer that it was going to replace the Drupal bootstrap process. That it was like, oh, we're just going to take out the lowest level of Drupal and we're going to put in Symfony and it's going to handle our requests for us. And everything on Drupal on top will remain the same. That didn't happen at all. What ended up happening was we put Symfony in at the lowest layer, and Symfony did things in an entirely different way than Drupal does. And rather than leaving Symfony as this kernel that's down at the bottom layer, instead what ended up happening is that the ideas of Symfony, not actually Symfony itself, then distributed through all of the entire project. And about 2 years ago, when the Drupal kernel went in, all of a sudden we started moving towards this tendency to decide that we needed to replace everything. So all of Drupal ended up getting rewritten after 2 years, and our target release date for Drupal prior to Drupal 8 was every 2 years. But right after the Drupal kernel went in, a mentality came around that we need to remove all procedural code. We need to change it all to dependency injected, object-oriented code following the Symfony principles. So it turned out that what we thought was going to be just a Symfony kernel at the middle actually ended up being, it's not Symfony all the way up, but it's the ideas and practices of Symfony all the way through the entire Drupal stack, which again is not even a bad thing. It's just something that we hadn't expected and something that adds a lot of complexity to our software. And we say in summary between all of these things, we really feel that Drupal is heading towards the enterprise, that it's really becoming a high-end product, and the enterprise is where its target is.
And that's for a couple of different reasons. Like the scalability is increasing But so are things like developer cost. And if you have an army of developers, it doesn't matter. You can throw them any projects and say, here's your task, go do it, and they'll do it, and that's fine. But if you're like a mom and pop shop and you're like, oh, I need to pay to have my site upgraded and I need to pay to have these modules upgraded, it's no longer a realistic goal for you to think about moving from 7 to 8.
So to back up that going enterprise statement, this is some numbers from builtwith.com, which tracks how or which CMSs are used to build what websites or which technologies are being used. And the interesting thing here, again, Drupal is going up in all categories. So it's not like we're in like this huge panic or anything like that. But this is Drupal market share by top 10,000 websites, 100,000 websites, and then top million websites. And you can see that Drupal's market share percentage has always been more popular with larger sites, basically those that are the more popular and more traversed websites on the internet. So the top 10,000 websites, Drupal runs almost 4% of the top 10,000 websites. But of the top million websites, it's the top 2%. And this lower end, we feel like we can't actually see into the future, but we feel like what will likely be happening here is that Drupal will continue to grow on the top end of the market and continue to fit more of the top 10,000 and top 100,000 websites. So our market share will continue to increase there, but potentially continue to stay relatively flat in the low end market.
And then the last thing we're worried about with Drupal is the distress we're hearing from the existing community. And this is divided into two major areas. The first one is cost. And this isn't just cost of developers, which is something I talked about too. It's also cost of hosting. It's cost of maintenance and upgrades. There's kind of a hidden cost when people get into Drupal. They hear it's free. And I like to tell them, no, it's like free isn't pony. Like this is not a puppy free. This is like a very expensive free, and there's going to be a lot of things that you've got to think about in terms of budgeting for your site long term. This is something that shocks people sometimes where they're like, I just paid thousands of dollars to have this new website built, and now you're telling me I have to invest twice as much just to keep it up to date. And it's kind of a hard pill for people to swallow. Upgrades in particular is the hardest thing, the thing we're most concerned about. We're facing this time now where a bunch of clients are coming and saying like, oh, should I think about Drupal 8 yet? I'm building a new site, or I've got an old one, can we move it? And it's like, well, let's put a price on that and see what it's actually worth to you. And that's where we're hearing a lot of pushback from the community. And then the next thing that people are worried about too is this learning curve, right? I'm sure you've probably seen this graph before. This is the Drupal learning cliff, right? Where it's really, really hard to figure out what's going on. And as trainers, we face this a lot, where you try and explain something to people and sometimes it feels like you're like making excuses for the software. Like, oh, back in Drupal 5, we did it this way, and this is just kind of left over. And that's not really how we want to describe our software. We want it to be more intuitive so people can guess and be correct with their inferences of how things should work. So we're hoping to take things in a little bit of a new direction. Like we've done a lot of complaining about Drupal 8. We want to now share with you how we're going to solve some of these problems.
So one of the areas, the first area that we talked about was decision-making process. So what we're planning on doing or hoping to do is shift towards an approach that has sort of more direction and more leadership, if you want to say, more planning in the organization of the software. And we're planning on doing this through something similar to a meritocracy. This is the definition of meritocracy. It's kind of been under attack recently with Just Cause, because meritocracy tends to make certain people feel really entitled, and that actually ends up hurting the overall community because those people that are considered to have a large amount of merit end up not respecting those that come in later that have a lot of value to provide, but they haven't actually been able to prove themselves yet. But they never prove themselves because those who have the merit are basically shutting them out or saying that they don't like their...
So we're going to be using meritocracy, but we're going to apply it to ideas as opposed to people. So rather than creating a system where people are promoted based on their merit, we're going to be applying this towards our code, like which decisions have merit, and we're going to include those in the project.
Right. But in order to do that, we need to do two things, and we need to both have someone or a group of someones that can decide what has merit. But in order to decide what has merit, you need to have criteria in which you evaluate those ideas against. And so we're going to talk first about the who here, who decides what has merit. And we're taking a page out of the Apache book where they have this concept called the PMC, or the Project Management Committee. And the Project Management Committee is basically conflict resolution. So this is our day-to-day workflow that we're hoping for, where we have daily code review and merging and things like that. And that's going to go through like a huge chunk of what we hope to have, as a large group of core committers. And from the Apache projects, it really surprised me the number of core committers that they have to any one of their projects. Like the web server itself has over 50 core committers, which I feel like is really beneficial because it actually makes it so that the review process doesn't get quite so bottlenecked like we have in Drupal land. But with that many core committers, what can often happen is that they can have disagreements even amongst themselves about what is appropriate for the project and what is not. And that's where the project management committee comes in. So we're separating the idea of the responsibility of people that are able to maintain and update the software from the decision making. So the decision making, for the most part, day-to-day is still made by the committers, but whenever there's an area of conflict or a question of overall direction of the project, that's where the project management committee is responsible for deciding, planning the release and deciding when a particular conflict happens, which way the project should go. And which way the project should go should be based on this second area, which is evaluating criteria to say, is this appropriate for the project or not? So one of the very first things we did, even before we started doing software development, was we tried to set out a set of principles and philosophies that say this is what this project is for. Like, this is why it exists, and this is the direction that we intend to stick on. And this is largely out of birthed from the situations in which BackDrop was conceived, and that one of our primary principles is to keep change to a minimum. We've been struck so hard by the differences between Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 that we intend to make it so that BackDrop has a small amount of changes between releases so that it's possible to keep up with it.
Not just the first release either, but every release. So you shouldn't have to worry about changing more than 10% of your code at any given time.
Yeah, and we're hoping to architect for the majority, and this is the idea of like those 1% situations where we end up with people that are highly motivated to build software or systems that are beneficial for them. We're hoping that we can mitigate that development for the minority and really stick to things that will benefit the majority of our users. And we also have a separate concept, instead of just architecting for the majority, but designing for the majority.
So architecting for the majority is about writing code that's really simple and easy for everyone to read. Designing for the majority is about including features that only apply to 80% of users. So it's about keeping the code simple as well as keeping the feature set scaled down, so controlling the scope. When you have something that applies to that, 1% or even 20% of people, it doesn't belong in core. We're leaving it to contrib.
Yeah, we still want to provide a lot of extensibility. And one of the most popular reasons for Drupal as it is today is because it's very extensible. And we don't want to take that away, that ability to take...
So this is about having APIs, right? So if we're saying we're leaving that 1% situation to contrib needs to have an API where they can use to do that. So even though there might not be something in the user interface to add that, there's going to be a hook there so you can write a module and you can plug it in.
Yeah, we'd like to keep the system requirements low. We feel like if we keep the system requirements low, that will increase our audience to the maximum number of people, so we'll be able to help more people. Planned and measured releases. We really want to make it so that we set out at the beginning and say, this is what we want to accomplish this release, and then set a date, and then actually hit that date. We feel like predictability in the release cycle makes it so that people can plan and be ready for, what they expect to be in the next version.
And also short release cycles too. So it's like this feature will be out in 3 months, and then the next feature will be out in another 3 months. And that way, if people come with I have something that needs to go in core, we can say, okay, well, we've scheduled that for a release that's 6 months in the future. And if we can keep that release cycle short enough, it'll encourage more core development, where as a developer, you see that feature in the software you're running on your sites now, rather than having to wait 4 years in order to get it out.
Yeah, we're running out of time, unfortunately, so I don't think we'll be able to go over each of these in depth quite as much as we want to. But we have some slides on this that Drupal 8 or Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 is roughly 20% code similarity based on diffing. We're hoping to keeping that more like 90% between releases, not just for this release. We're talking about Drupal 7 to BackDrop 1.0. We're saying that will be like a 10% code change. But we also think that that'll be continuous, so BackDrop 2, BackDrop 3, BackDrop 4. Architecting for the majority, this is what we mean by that. We're trying to make it so that we can get as many people as possible into the software as easily as possible. Better code isn't necessarily better for the community. That's the kind of thinking that we've been feeling from Drupal 8, that we've been refactoring a whole bunch of stuff saying that this is better code, but that ends up causing a lot of distress amongst the existing community. So this is, again, designing for the majority. Let's focus on features that actually help the majority of our users. We pulled this 1% rule from actually the WordPress philosophy, and it's a general internet phenomenon that amongst any community, this isn't just software development, but any online community, there's the 1% that is the content creators, the 9% that is the content like feedback, so the people that post comments, or the people who provide like in our case, yeah, issue queues or reports or bugs or review things. And then there's the 90%, and those are the people that are just the consumers. They don't actually interact with the community in a way that is actually visible, but they're still actually consuming the software.
We did a bunch of research too before the Drupal Watchdog ad that article that we wrote in this last issue, that in the Drupal community it is actually much more extreme than this. It's like 1% and then 2%, and so you have to think about, like, there's 98% of the Drupal community that isn't involved in this decision-making process. And so what we're going to try and do in BackDrop is think about, like, how do the decisions that this minority of us makes affect the rest of the community.
So extensibility, we'd still really like to make it so that, I'm sorry, going backwards. We'd still like to make it so that the extensibility that Drupal has, we want to keep that and maintain it. We still want to make it so that these websites that have been built on Drupal today, we want to make it so that they have a way forward to move to a system that they can migrate to and keep all of their existing code with a minimal amount of effort. So BackDrop, when will it be released? Like when, what's our timeline? We're saying that we're trying to have planned and measured releases. So what does that actually come out to? So we had been saying summer 2014, which is basically right now. Unfortunately, when we set this timeline, it was 9 months ago when we first started the project, and we didn't quite have a good understanding of quite exactly how many resources we consumed as Drupal developers. We
didn't know how long it was going to take. Like, we knew the scope of the work we had to do, but we didn't realize how long it would take to actually do that work. So we have an adjusted release date.
Yeah. So we're going to say
which is soon.
Yeah, which is soon. We're still trying to work really hard to get this software out and released. And we're going to say fall 2014. So
we're pretty close, and we're going to show you.
Yeah. So where are we now? So what is BackDrop now, and how is it different from Drupal 8? We've got a lot of great things, and we have built out a lot of mobile and responsive touch work. In this case, we've taken admin menu rather than building out a new toolbar. We've taken admin menu, made it responsive and touch friendly, and built that into BackDrop. So this is on an iPad. It's all touch and responsive friendly, which is great. Configuration management, we ported configuration management from Drupal 8 into BackDrop. This basically means putting all of your configuration into something that is not the database. And which actually in Drupal 8 it is the database, but it's confusing. It's a separate part of the database. It makes it so that you can move things from dev stage to live and between different servers separate from your content. So configuration is located in one place, content is located in another, and you can move the configuration along with your code between different environments. So
for those of you who've been fighting with Drupal 7 and features, this will solve all of your problems.
yes, it is the end of features, the death of features.
Sorry, features.
So we're really happy with configuration management and the way that has come out in BackDrop
It's
land.
very different in BackDrop than it is from Drupal 8 in terms of a code perspective, but it's the same feature set.
It's the same functionality. Yep. Views in core. It's one of the just most obvious things that we could possibly do. We have views pretty well fully integrated into BackDrop. It's using configuration management to save and export all of its views. It's also integrated with the new Ajax and dialog framework and all of the remnants of C-tools. Either they were moved into core or ported into BackDrop into a way that was compatible with our code. So excellent. Views in core, you have to have it. And this is probably the one thing that is going to be a differentiating feature from Drupal 8 is that we're really coming along strongly in building out a new blocks and layout system. So this is the equivalent. Jen's really excited because it's panels, and she loves panels. So it's
my favorite module.
It's basically it's panels in core, but in a way that's fully integrated. So it's replacing the idea of regions being provided by themes and blocks only being able to be placed in one particular region. Like that entire system has got a lot of problems. And what we've done is we've taken this idea of panels and contexts and settings and the configuration management and made it so that you can set up as many layouts as you want to. You can take any individual page and add a layout to that page, and then you can place the blocks around it. Our initial version almost certainly will not be quite as comprehensive as panels, but the architecture of panels is there because it's literally a port.
It'll work for the 80%, and the rest is left to contrib.
Well, and with our regular releases, we'll add more functionality after the initial release. So we've really been scaling down in terms of what our overall scope is to try to meet our deadline. And even though we won't be able to meet summer 2014, we are still focusing really strongly on our top three, which is configuration management, views and core, and blocks and layouts. And that may mean that a lot of the other areas in which we strove to complete won't actually happen. But
in the first release.
But it's important that we get a release out because, as we found, it's really hard to get people excited about software that doesn't exist yet. So,
so like, let's just get it done. And
so we need to have something that people can actually use.
And if we have those releases coming out soon enough too, then it won't be too long before we can add some of the things later. So this idea of like build a hook for it, don't build a user interface. You can write it in contrib if you want, or we can add it later in core and we can make it better as time goes. But yeah, I think making something that works and is out is more important.
Okay. Michael, have we got any time for questions, or should we just
go for it?
Go for it? Why not? Well,
because when's the next one?
It's a 10, so we've got 10 minutes. I think we should just say thank you
You're
guys.
around all weekend.
Yeah.
You can talk to us in the hallways, at the party, anywhere else. I know there's probably a ton of questions, and we'd like to hear all of them. We're obviously sprinting on Sunday, so if you're really excited, we'd love to have you come work with us. But yeah, if you have questions, come find us wherever and ask.
Yeah, we're at backdropcms.org and on GitHub /backdrop. Thank you guys so much for listening.